Hi, this is Andy. As you listen in on today's episode, let me ask you this. Is it possible to be too nice? And I ask this because this is a question that we have vigorous discussion around in our Essentials of Project Management workshop. And when I ask this question, there's almost always a resounding response of, oh, yeah, it's possible to be too nice. That discussion is based around an idea we covered back in episode 320 with Greg Githins. Greg says that leadership is a practice of kindness, but it's not always a practice of niceness. Well, today I'm joined by Rachel Luna. She's the author of a new book entitled Permission to Offend, The Compassionate Guide for Living Unfiltered and Unafraid. Now, did you catch that title? Permission to Offend. In a world where people are so concerned about offending each other or being taken out by cancel culture, it's a surprising book that I'm looking forward to introducing you to in this episode today. Are there times when you feel like you should be speaking up, but are afraid to do so? Or when you worry perhaps too much about what other people think? Have you found yourself confounded on why someone reacted the way they did? Well, stay with us here because Rachel's going to share some insights that you can start putting to work right away. Hey, quick note. You know how important it is to develop your ability to lead and deliver. That's why you're listening today. But too often, students don't learn these skills until they're thrown into it in the early years of their career. If you know a high school or college-age student and want to invest in them, check out our new e-learning program entitled Getting Stuff Done, Project Management for Students. They can learn how to reduce their stress and thrive with their schooling now, and you'll be giving them a head start to more confidently lead and deliver when they launch their career. Learn more and get a copy at peopleandprojectspodcast.com/gettingstuffdone. Thanks. Well, let's jump into today's discussion with Rachel about her book, Permission to Offend. Rachel, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Hello, Andy. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you today.
I've been looking forward to this. Before we get into what you mean by permission to offend, let's start with what it doesn't mean. Okay. So what are some messages you don't want people to get from your book?
Thank you. That's a great question because this book is not a weapon. And when I say permission to offend, I do not mean to start going out in town and telling people off and being a jerk and flipping them off, cutting them off in traffic, giving them the look, nothing like that.
I read the book.
The first time I talked about permission to offend, I was at an event and I said, offend them. You give yourself permission to offend. People are going to be offended that you have a dream. People are going to be offended that you're pursuing what matters to you most. So just let them be offended. And a woman came up to me later that day and she said, I went up to my room after you spoke and I told my roommate all about herself because permission to offend, huh? And right home, girl. And she went to high five me and I looked at her and I said, whoa. No, that's not what I meant at all. So it's not about weaponizing your truth, nor is it about creating division or strife among communities. It really is about creating more community connection and contribution.
Yeah, that's good. All right. So this is an oversimplification, but I'd love for you to, I won't say validate, I'll say verify how close I got to the core message of your book. So we're too easily offended and we hold ourselves back because we're afraid we might offend others. And the result is it's lose-lose. We live in fear and those around us miss the contributions we could have made. Right. So it's not exactly what your book is, but how close did I get? And how do you
That's pretty good. I feel like I'm going to have to steal that soundbite. And just that was excellent. Yeah. And I will add to that. The critical element of all of this is embracing freedom and ensuring that you are connected to your truth and to your identity. And this is work that we're not taught in school. And when someone even softball pitches you the idea of identity work, it just doesn't seem to be a priority. I don't know if you've had this experience, Andy, but this whole idea of working on my identity doesn't seem like a priority when I need to work on my skills as a leader, when I need to work on my skills as a communicator, when I need to work on my skills as a parent or teacher. But what I want people to understand is that when you work on your identity, that makes you infinitely better at all of those other roles.
That's right. And to the point of easily offended, if I know what my identity is, I'm not going to be as easily offended because I know why I have that identity. It's not some flimsy facade. It allows you to, I think it wasn't bruised, but not broken.
Yes.
But it was, I think that was a section of the book when that comedian was hearing other people talking about her. She was, I'm not saying it didn't hurt, but she also wasn't broken. Right.
Right. Well, see, this is what you and I were speaking about earlier, is that there is an opportunity for us to leverage these liabilities. Mm-hmm. And so for her in that moment, as she's listening to these people speak ill of her, it did hurt. Of course it did. But rather than being offended and staying in the offense, she took their feedback, as painful as it was, and she used it to anchor more into her truth and to develop her skills. And all of that ultimately led her to then be on one of the top rated nationally syndicated shows for more than a decade. So right. It's like, are you willing to be offended in pursuit of your truth and in pursuit of more freedom of expression?
Yeah. You had at least one Brene Brown quote in the book, and maybe a couple, but so one that I've called back to, I think is related to this, is she goes, in the absence of data, we always make up stories. And something that I took away from your book is in spite of the data or despite the data, we still make up stories. It's not even just the absence of data. We make up stories. And so you have a section there about the story loop that I just feel like is enormously powerful. And I'd love it if you'd walk us through this loop and how it works and maybe illustrate with an example.
Sure. So I love that you mentioned that even in spite of the data, because one of the stories that I talk about, and it has been a story that I've worked very hard to dismantle, to disprove, is that my father abandoned me. So my biological mother passed away when I was 3.5 years old. She had AIDS. My father was also infected with AIDS. So he did what he thought was best at that time, and he gave me away to my godmother. Now, when you're 4 years old and you're given away, you have a choice that you don't realize on the conscious, right? 4 years old, how much consciousness do you really have? But the unconscious mind is now deciding, was I given away or was I abandoned? Was I accepted by someone or was I rejected by another? So rather than look at the acceptance that I received by my godmother, whom I call my mommy, and do not even call her anything less because I'll pop, just kidding. But so despite the acceptance and love that I received from my mom's family, I only interpreted that circumstance in my life as a rejection from my father. And for years, I told myself the story that I was abandoned. But Andy, what I teach in the story loop, so let's break this down. So remember that part of the story and let's talk about this. So something happens and either a thought or a feeling occurs. Sometimes these emotions, these feelings are unconscious. And what this looks like is something happens and you don't think anything of it, but all of a sudden you feel bad. And you don't even remember why you feel bad. You don't know what happened, just you have this meh feeling about yourself. Or a thought occurs. From that thought, you tell yourself a story about the situation. And then based on that story, now there's a result or an action or a behavior. Many times, if the story is negative, if the thought is negative, then you react. If the story is positive or if the story serves you, then you'll respond. And we really want to be careful between our responses and our reactions, because a response is thoughtful and intentional. And a reaction is typically explosive and rooted in some sort of fear or doubt or rejection, some sort of a negative entity, if you will. So now we understand how the story happens, right? So if we look at what with my dad, so I told myself the story that he abandoned me. The other story that I told myself was that everyone I love leaves me. Why? Because my mother died and then my father left. And those were people that I loved. So now I spent my whole life looking for evidence for those stories to be true. So even when my father did reach out to me, even when he did do things, I only ever judged him from the lowest negative standard. Now here's the plot twist. When you do this work to validate or disprove the story, you have to really confront the facts of the situation. So the fact is, yes, my father did give custody to my godmother. But here's a fact that I never acknowledged, nor did I ever consider it in my stories. There was a moment where my mom said to my dad, "Hey, I want to adopt her." And my dad said, "Okay." And they made a plan to go down to the lawyer's office and meet. And my mother went down there and she waited and she waited and she waited. And this was back in the days where there were no cell phones or ways to get a hold. So if you got stood up, you just got stood up and you didn't know what happened. Several hours later, she gets home. She calls my father and says, "What happened?" And he said, "I'm so sorry. I just couldn't give her up." So you see, my father's story was that as long as I don't give her up for adoption, I never abandoned her. I never left her. I was always here. That was his story. My story was, because he gave me to her, he abandoned me. And do you see that the fact is, he made a choice that in his mind was the best thing for me. And you know what, Andy? Looking back now between you and I, that was the best thing he could have ever done. Because the part of the story I haven't told you is that my father lived in poverty. My father lived on Section 8 and food stamps. And because he was sick, he was on disability, he really could not care for me. But when he made that choice to give me to my mother, I now had access to private school, to privilege, to vacation and dance classes, a lifetime of experiences that I never would have known with my father.
But, you know, I would have to think there's plenty of us that are driven by the 4-year-old version of Andy or his understanding of things, right? And don't get past that. And I feel like what this book does a remarkably good job of is helping you kind of uncover some of that, perhaps thinking it through. And even still knowing I need to go look at facts can make it difficult to look at facts, but because we filter through things, but still it's just the recognition that there might be some facts here that I don't know about, and you've discovered some. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And you know, you said something else too. Looking at facts can be difficult. Why is it difficult? Because when we look at the facts, it may be contrary to our beliefs and our values. And what makes up our identity is just that, what we believe and what we value. So when the facts come in to show us something contrary to our beliefs, all of a sudden our identity is fractured. And now we have to decide, who am I now? That what I've been believing to be true for all these years is in fact not true. And then who you are now becomes who you choose to believe you are and what you choose to believe about yourself, your circumstances, and the events of your life.
I love it. And they could be like huge life, transforming things like you had, or it could be something, let's say at work. And I would give you a scenario. I'd love to look at it through the lens of the story loop. I've mentioned this actually in a previous episode, so people listening to us may remember a little bit of discussion on this when we were talking with Amanda Ripley on conflict. But a workshop participant told me this story. It's one of her senior leaders at her company. They now call her the salad lady. Okay, now here's the backstory. She was supposed to get a half hour on the agenda of a lunchtime senior leadership team meeting. Okay, and she's one of the senior leaders, but she was told when she got there she's only going to get something like 5 to 10 minutes. So she grabbed her salad, she stormed out of the room, and was so upset that she was disrespected. Now, I think anybody observing this might be, that's irrational, but we're all capable of acting in ways that others might think irrational. So we have to speculate here because we can't pass the mic to her. But I would love for the listeners to learn how we can recognize this story loop. Okay. So let's start with what happened. She was told her time on the agenda was changed. Okay. Now, the next step of the loop is that you have a thought.
She had a thought or a feeling.
A feeling, and turned it into a story. So we're speculating here, but any thoughts about what maybe, based on what you know?
I would imagine, and as a speaker myself, when you are a speaker, you think you have X amount of time, so you prepare. You really put like Andy, you've done such a great job preparing for all of these podcast episodes, right? And so now someone tells you you had 45 minutes, now you have 3. All your preparation is that. What happens now is your unconscious, subconscious mind goes into survival, right? Oh my gosh, they're cutting me off from the people. Remember, our brains are wired for survival. And we understand that in order to survive, based on our primitive years, we needed to be in community. We needed to be with the people and the food bringers and the food gatherers. And so, even though there was nothing to do with her surviving, she wouldn't die, there was that intrinsic thought of, they are cutting me out. Mm-hmm. And so now some of the stories that begin to form in the unconscious mind is, they don't value me. They don't think I'm good enough. They're disrespecting me. Someone else is better than me. I'm not going to stand up there to be some fill-in for 3 minutes when I deserve. So there's this idea of, I should be treated better. And if I'm not treated better, I'm going to leave because they don't value me.
Yeah. And so then she reacted, right? She didn't respond. She reacted. And my guess is, if she could take it back, maybe she would think differently, or maybe not. Maybe there are some real issues there about respect for her, how they treat women. I mean, there could be all kinds of things that are not just poof made up, like there's probably backstory here. But the reason why I wanted to just poke at this loop a little bit more is, I think sometimes we're like, why did I send that email? Why did I react that way? And like you said multiple times in the book, and you said today too, sometimes we're not even aware of the stories we're telling ourselves. So what are the facts, right? Because that's the part of your freedom framework is acknowledge the loop, and then what are the facts?
What are the facts? What's the story? And what are the facts, right? So, but here's why we react. The reason that we react is because on the unconscious level, we are afraid of disconnection. We are afraid that something's going to happen that is threatening our survival. And for people that have experienced trauma, rejection, marginalization, you have a higher likelihood of reacting versus responding, because it is a trauma reaction. It's a trauma response. Now, you know what she could have done, Andy, is she could have said, that's interesting. Why are you cutting my time? Before grabbing the salad. And that's what I teach in the book, is that curiosity is the key to clarity. So you want to ask questions before getting all your panties in a bunch and getting really angry and frustrated. By the way, that anger and frustration is a warning sign to you. It's your brain saying, we don't feel good about this. We need some attention here. Okay. So it's the inner child also kind of battling. So she could have said, why are you cutting my time? Then she could have stuck around to hear the answer. Now, maybe they said, we're cutting your time because someone else came in. Maybe we're cutting your time because we have to exit the room early. Whatever the reason that they were cutting her time.
In fact, it could have been, we have to cut it and we value it so much, we want the full thing later. It could have turned into a compliment or a build-up thing instead of, right?
Right. It could have been something where they brought her back to do an entire workshop. Right. Now, here's the thing. What she really could have done is she could have used those 3 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever to really position herself as a leader who knows how to be nimble, who knows how to accommodate a room, because those people that can accommodate events like that, they're the ones that get invited back. If you're nimble, if you're quick, if you're malleable, that is helpful. Now, how do we do this? Here's the question I hear someone asking. But wait a second, I thought you said I'm supposed to give myself permission to offend. And didn't Andy start by saying, is being a pleaser a bad thing? So there's a way, I call it the empathetic offender. And so we talk about this in the book as well. What she did, right? She was the wounded offender. She was so angry. She grabbed her salad. She walked out the door. The pleaser would have said, oh, okay, no big deal, and kind of shrunk in and been upset and sad, but said nothing. Now, the empathetic offender takes a different approach. If she were operating in her empathetic offender identity, she could have asked the question, okay, why is my time being cut? She would have listened to the information, and then she could have said, well, I spent a lot of time preparing for the time that you gave me. I'm disappointed that you're cutting my time, but I'm a team player. So I'm going to give you the best 5 minutes that I've got. And if we don't get to everything that I wanted to share, you should bring me back. That would have been a beautiful response with empathy, but not being a pleaser or a doormat or bending down to people's will.
You know, I was thinking of right when you said it, Rachel, was Will Smith in his when he went up and did this laugh. If you had grabbed the mic and said, hey, you know, I really don't like it when my wife is talked about that way, but let me tell you, there's a condition that she has, and it's worthy of your contributions. And if you would donate this cause, can you imagine the difference?
Oh my goodness.
You know? But that's easy to see in somebody else, right? It's another thing when in the moment when I've got, you know, the blood boiling too, but if we can learn that pause, and I feel like that's what your book is trying to get us to do, just a little pause between stimulus and response here to think it through, right? That's kind of what the idea.
You know what's a way to practice this? Because those reactions are going to happen, but if you can catch it as soon as it happens, and then whoever you're having the interaction with, acknowledge, I'm sorry, that was a reaction. I really should have taken the moment. What I meant to say was, and I do this with my kids a lot because, you know, I'm a hot-blooded Puerto Rican. So the work that I teach in this book is just years and years of experience, but I'll do that with my kids. You know, they'll do, inevitably, children do a lot of things to kind of take you out of character, do they not? Sure, and so inevitably, one of my children will do something, and then I'll just say, you know what? That was an overreaction. I'm sorry. What I'm feeling right now is this. And the story I'm telling myself is that. But the truth is, and so not only do I get to process so that the anger, the emotions that happen in the body can dissipate, can pass, but now I'm modeling the behavior for my children. But this also works as leaders, right?
For sure.
I'm a former Marine, if I may just share that. So I'm a former Marine, and I've worked with a lot of leaders. Some have been amazing, and some, the only reason I listened to them was because it was my job, right? And my job was in jeopardy if I didn't. But the leaders that I respected the most were the ones that were willing to get in the trenches with me, were the ones that were willing to take ownership and apologize when they were out of line. Those are the leaders that I would, to this day, go back into the battlefield and put my life on the line, because I understand that they genuinely care and they're working on having a better relationship with our team as a whole.
That's good. You know, I could talk about that whole story thing for a long time, but there's another thing that I thought was pretty powerful in your book was your conversation about limiting beliefs. You know, because I hear people regularly say, well, I just could never, you know, fill in the blank, or, but I'm only a, you know, fill in the blank. It's easy to see their limiting beliefs coming to the surface, but I think it's a lot more difficult for us to see ourselves. So what's a potential way to flush out beliefs that might be holding us back?
Yes. Well, let's talk about this in the leadership capacity, right? So I can't finish this project because, right? And so, because my team isn't doing their job, because so-and-so is on vacation, because I don't have the equipment. So I ask people to just start with this sentence. I can't do blank because blank.
Right. Yeah.
And then we go again, why not? And I ask you to ask the question why 3 times, so that you can really get to the bottom of, well, really to get to the core of the truth. And it may be, I can't finish this project in time because I don't have the capacity and I'm afraid to look weak by asking for more time. And that, once we get to that, now we can make really, really good decisions about how to move forward.
Yeah. I love that formula. I can't because I don't know, sometimes, you know, you're working under assumptions. You don't even realize they're assumptions until you get it on writing. And then when it's in writing, you can look at it and go, well, wait a minute, you know, what would it take? Or is that true? Or what could, maybe we do instead of. And it's just a simple formula. I can't because, right? That's good.
And you know what's also really important as well, Andy, is to not just answer the question in your head,
Yeah.
but to write the answer, because things sound infinitely different in your mind than they do when you read it back on paper. In your mind, it sounds rational. Your limiting beliefs sound rational in your mind.
Right.
Once you write them down and read them, now because there's distance. So once you put that distance, now you can see the irrationality, or sometimes the rationality, but you can see the fear behind the rationality. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. So, and I'm thinking, because you talk about between a therapist or a coach or a mastermind group, it could also be if somebody else reads it, I'd imagine they could be like, Rachel, what are you talking about?
Right.
Because they would have, if they're assuming they're an advocate for you, they might look at it and go, wait a minute.
Yeah. What were you thinking? Let's talk about this, friend. Let's break this down.
Yeah. I'd love if people just spend time on that section and think about those beliefs. We talked a little bit about the pleaser identity. It's so easy to think about the downsides of, well, like they're a people pleaser, right? Like it's easy to think of that. What are some upsides? And then after you kind of talk about that, I'd be interested in if there's just one piece of advice that you might suggest for someone who's more of a pleaser to do to kind of move along the way you're trying to nudge them, what would they do? So benefits and then actions, maybe.
Yes. Okay. So the benefit of the pleaser is that they really operate from a place of compassion and empathy. So those two qualities are such powerful connectors. So when you're operating in the pleaser, the great thing is that you are attentive to the needs of other people, and you're really great at fostering community. And we need community to survive. So if you are the pleaser, I just want you to know we do need that. And when you model that behavior, when you model that connection and community and that level of just doing one extra thing to make other people feel comfortable, that really then teaches the critics or the wounded people of the world how to show up in a more powerful, loving way. So great job on that. And then what was the second part of the question?
We know the downside of it is they may sign up for things, they maybe just hold things in. But if somebody feels like, I'm probably a little bit of a pleaser, or maybe a lot of a pleaser, if you were to coach a pleaser or past pleasers that you've coached, what can you think of one thing? They need to read the book to get the full advice, but one thing they might want to consider doing.
Yes.
For example, what comes to mind for me, and I'd love your thought on this. Verification versus validation. I feel like that is such a big part of this book. And I think that applies to pleasers, doesn't it?
Yes. Okay. So we talk about verification versus validation and decisions by committee. Okay. Right. So a pleaser will make a lot of decisions by committee. What does this mean? This means you have a choice to make. And instead of taking into account what you want and what matters to you and where your heart is leading you, or if you're a God girl like me, where the Holy Spirit is guiding you, you start asking your mother, your brother, your spouse, everyone else to chime in and help make the decision for you. So the first thing is, as a pleaser, I want to encourage you to stop making decisions by committee. If you really do need support, then I would encourage you to use the verification versus validation method. Now, we often seek validation because we want to be told that the thing we want to do is right, or the thing that we believe is right and true. When we're looking for verification, we're just making sure that what we want to do is aligned with our truth, our values, our beliefs, and our identity. So for the pleaser, the next time you have a choice to make, instead of making your decision by committee, I would encourage you to first identify, why do you want this thing in the first place? And then what will it do for your life? How will it enrich or enhance or deter or detract? And then as you narrow down your choice, you can go to your committee and say, hey, I've made a decision to do X. Here's why I think X is a good idea for me. can you just verify that what I'm thinking actually makes sense? And then give them these metrics of verification.
That's good. So I think of the validator or needing validation as I need to make this decision because then I'll be okay with people. Where this is more like, would you verify that my assumptions are good, or
Right.
am I missing some risks? It's not
Right.
is am I okay? Is that roughly along the lines?
Exactly, exactly. It's
Yeah.
verify this, poke some holes in this to make sure that I'm on the right track according to what I want, not according to what you think is best.
Yeah, yeah, right. It's fundamentally different. I
Mhm.
was intrigued by the whole offense capacity quotient, or OCQ, and I just wondered if you would give us an example of the difference between low OCQ and high OCQ thoughts, and maybe
Yes.
some ideas on how to move a little bit more towards those high.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's first explain it to them. Okay. So, as Andy mentioned in the very beginning, that sometimes we don't offend people because we are so easily offended. And I talk about this all the time. We don't want people to feel the thing that we do not like to feel ourselves. So, really, not wanting to offend people is a source of protection for ourselves and for others. But it's so detrimental because there are some things, there are some conversations that need to be had. And sometimes people will perceive those as offensive, even if they're really not, even if it's a true statement.
Yeah, right.
So, what I posture in the book is that in order to speak your truth, in order to live more fully self expressed, in order to be a more capable and powerful leader, you have to have a thicker skin. You have to have a higher capacity to be offended. Hence the offense capacity quotient. Okay. So when you have a low OCQ, when you have low offense capacity, you are the type of person that asks, well, that's not you'll say things like that's never going to work. That's dumb. This makes no sense. You people are going to ruin the whole team, right? So it's a lot of negativity, and it's rooted in fear. But a high offense capacity quotient thought would be, that's interesting. Tell me why you think that's going to work.
Right.
What does that look like? Here's another example in the workplace, especially for our leaders. Someone on your team makes a negative comment and you feel disrespected. A low OCQ thought is, ugh, how dare you? You are so disrespectful. You have no place on this team. We need to move you to another department immediately. It's a low offense capacity. High offense capacity will pull the person to the side and say, hey, Andy, I want to have a conversation with you apart from the group, privately. When you said this, I really interpreted as, and you say how you interpreted it. What did you mean by that? What did you mean when you made this comment? Is that really how you feel? And you wait and you let the person answer, and then you express. Because when you said that, what I heard was, and what I made it mean was that, and you fill in the blank. Is that what you really meant? I'd like to discuss this further. And now you have dialogue and you have communication, and you can find hopefully a point of connection. Now, if the person is really committed to some heinous, behavior that goes against the company core values or the organization's values, then that's a whole different subject. But often people don't really mean what they're saying. They just don't have the language or the vocabulary or ability to articulate their truth. And they just need someone to ask some clarifying questions.
So good. I'm thinking back to your curiosity comment that high OCQ would be more keep the curiosity. Like there's a quote attributed to President Eisenhower, because it's not word for word, it's very close. Let us never confuse honest dissent with disloyal subversion. So low OCQ would be, that's disloyal subversion, right? But a high ICQ or OCQ would be, well, wait a minute. Maybe this is honest dissent and I need to listen to this.
Yes.
Maybe not, but still, maybe. You actually have a quiz on your website that can help us.
I do have a quiz. Yeah, you can go to permissiontooffend.com/quiz and take the quiz and see where you stand. And there are some strategies to help you if you have a low or mid OCQ. And if you have a high OCQ, which I'm sure many of the listeners are because you're all leaders, I teach you how to take it to the next level and really stand up as a leader in this work.
So I'm a big believer it's not if as much as when. So it's not if you have high or low, it's when you have high or low. And I think I taking a quiz, and it's all free, right? You just go to the website.
Yes, totally free, totally free. Yes. And that's a really great point because there are moments where we're human beings. We are going to have low OCQ days.
Right.
And I talk about this as well. You know, there are going to be moments where you are the critic, where you are the pleaser, where you are operating in the wounded. The goal isn't that you're always the empathetic offender. Really, the important work is recognizing when you're being the critic, when you're being the pleaser, when you're operating from your wounded, and what shifts need to happen so that you can approach the circumstance or situation with more love, compassion, and empathy.
Yeah, well said. There's so many things I'd love to talk to you about, but let's end with this. And you already started down this path with an earlier answer. We've got a lot of parents who listen to the podcast. Can you think of anything else that you and your husband do as examples of what you've tried to do to instill these ideas in your daughters?
We really give ourselves permission to get it wrong. And I think that's something that we're not allowing each other to do as a society these days. There's a lot of emphasis on getting it right and saying the right thing and looking the right part. And I am on a mission to foster more compassion for people failing, making mistakes, unintentionally saying or doing the wrong thing out of sheer ignorance, rather than, castigating people for having a moment of humanity. So that's what we do.
That's so good. Well, for those listening, if you've appreciated the ideas that Rachel and I have been talking about, get a copy of her book, Permission to Offend. I'll put links to the book and Rachel's website in the show notes for this cast. So Rachel, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's been such a pleasure.